The trauma bay had gone completely silent, save for the flat, unbroken scream of the cardiac monitor. Dr. Pierce Okonkwo, chief of emergency surgery at Grady Memorial Hospital, stood pressed against the far wall of Bay 1, with the forearm of a 240-pound Green Beret resting across his chest. He was not being manhandled. The operator hadn't even raised his voice. He had simply stepped between the doctor and the operating table when the woman in the blue technician's scrubs asked him to, and there he remained. Arms crossed, expression neutral, immovable as load-bearing concrete. On the table, Staff Sergeant Damon Chu had flatlined 4 minutes ago. The woman working on him was elbow-deep in his open chest, her gloved hands moving with the kind of controlled, unhurried precision that had no business existing in this room, under these lights, in the hands of someone whose laminated badge read L. Bast, Emergency Services Technician. 3 weeks before that moment, Lauryn Bast had been assigned to clean the storage closets. Grady Memorial was a Level 1 trauma center in the middle of Atlanta, and it ran the way Level 1 trauma centers always run: loud, perpetually understaffed, and dependent on a tightly enforced hierarchy that had very little patience for anyone who didn't know their lane. The attending surgeons were gods. The charge nurses were something older and more elemental than gods. The residents were anxious apprentices, and the ER techs were the gears and levers that kept the whole machine from grinding itself to pieces, essential, invisible, and interchangeable. Lauryn Bast was supposed to be interchangeable. She was 31 years old, and she was conspicuously wrong for the role. The other techs in her orientation cohort were fresh-faced kids, 22 and 23, still wearing their nervousness like a second's skin. Lauryn wore nothing like that. She was quiet in a way that wasn't shyness. It was containment. She had fine lines at the corners of her eyes that had no business being there at 31. And a posture so habitually correct that the other techs sometimes caught themselves straightening up when she walked into the room, without quite knowing why. Sandra Reel, the charge nurse who had been running the Grady ER floor for 19 years, looked at Lauryn on day 1 and thought, wrong fit. Not because she seemed incapable. Because she seemed like someone doing a very deliberate job of seeming incapable, and Sandra, who had seen every variety of human being wash through this emergency department, recognized the effort. She didn't act on the thought. There was too much else to do. Dr. Pierce Okonkwo didn't bother with any thought at all. He saw Lauryn's badge, noted her title, and filed her into a category. He was not an unkind man by nature. He was simply extraordinarily efficient, and efficiency, applied to people, can look a great deal like cruelty. He had no time for support staff in roles he considered beneath his attention. He barely had enough time for his own residents. Lauryn, for her part, didn't seem to mind. She took the bedpan assignments. She restocked the crash carts with an almost arithmetical precision that the day shift coordinator quietly appreciated but never mentioned. She showed up early and left late and never complained, and she moved through the controlled chaos of the ER floor with that quiet, slightly eerie economy of motion that a few of the nurses had started to notice but couldn't quite articulate. It was small things. The way she repositioned a semi-conscious patient's head without being asked, clearing the airway before the paramedics even called it. The way she laid out a trauma supply kit in the precise sequence a surgeon would use when she'd only been asked to bring the kit to the bay. The way she clocked a patient's deteriorating color before the monitors showed anything and casually repositioned herself near the crash cart, which she would later claim was coincidence. The first time she directly spoke up was in week 2. A 26-year-old man came in through triage with a crush injury to his left forearm from a hydraulic press at a warehouse. He was in obvious pain, which was expected. What wasn't noticed was the particular quality of that pain, and the way his forearm had gone rigid and tense in a manner that hydraulic crush injuries sometimes produced. Lauryn noticed. She flagged it to the triage nurse, who was overwhelmed and wrote it in the chart. It went nowhere. Lauryn found Dr. Okonkwo at the station between bays, reviewing imaging on a tablet. Dr. Okonkwo, she kept her voice level. The patient in Bay 3, the hydraulic press injury, His pain is disproportionate to the wound, and his forearm compartment feels tense. His radial pulse is weak on palpation. I think he may be developing. You think? Okonkwo didn't look up from his tablet. Ms. Bast, what exactly is your clinical training? I'm an ear tech. Right. He set the tablet down then, and he looked at her with the expression he reserved for second-year residents who had exceeded their scope. You are an ER tech. You are not a diagnostician. You are not a clinician. If you have a concern, you write it in the chart. You do not approach attending physicians with differential diagnoses. Am I clear? Yes, sir. Good. I believe bed 7 needs a linen change. Lauryn nodded once and walked away. 3 hours later, the orthopedic consultant called Okonkwo to confirm acute compartment syndrome in the patient from Bay 3. Emergency fasciotomy. The patient kept his arm. Nobody connected it to the ER tech who had flagged it at 7 o'clock. Sandra watched Lauryn absorb all of this, the dismissals, the grunt work, the invisible warnings that turned out to be right, and she filed it away without knowing exactly what she was filing or why she bothered. On the Wednesday night that changed everything, the red emergency line at the charge desk rang at 11:14 p.m. Sandra had heard that phone ring twice in 19 years. Both times had left marks. She picked it up, listened, set it down with a hand that wasn't entirely steady. I need bays 1 through 4 cleared, she announced to the floor, and her voice had that specific, stripped-down quality it took on when things were genuinely bad, as opposed to merely terrible. Code red military transport. They're diverting a medevac from Fort Benning. Mechanical failure on the primary bird. ETA 6 minutes. The ER reorganized itself around the crisis with frantic speed. Patients were shuffled, equipment repositioned, and 3 military police officers arrived through the ambulance bay doors 2 minutes later, sweeping the civilian lobby with a quiet authority that made everyone in the waiting room go very still. Okonkwo came in at a jog from the attending lounge, buttoning his coat. Lauryn had been in the hallway restocking a crash cart when the call came through. She didn't move toward the bay immediately. She stood for a moment and looked at the MPs. Specifically at their unit patches, their communication gear, the frequency bands visible on the radios clipped to their vests. She read the insignia the way someone reads a language they grew up speaking. Then she set down the supply box and walked to Bay 1. They came in fast. 4 operators in blood-soaked camouflage running a gurney at a pace that civilians never quite see outside of the real thing. Staff Sergeant Damon Chu lay on that gurney, and he looked like the aftermath of something rather than a person, uniform shredded, 2 hemostatic dressings compressed against wounds in his upper left abdomen, his face the particular gray-white that happens when a body has been fighting for too long. Sergeant First Class Riker, the team sergeant, was the large one. A man who looked like he had been constructed for the specific purpose of carrying things that were too heavy. He called out the handoff in rapid, precise shorthand. 2 gunshot wounds to the upper left quadrant, IED fragmentation to the lower extremities, hemostatic applied at point of injury. BP was 84/60 at extraction, 34 minutes in trance. The other 3 operators didn't say anything. They took up positions along the walls of Bay 1 with the quiet, purposeful stillness of people who understand the difference between useful and in the way. Okonkwo took the handoff and ran. Whatever his flaws were, he was good at this. His mind organized the trauma quickly, called for imaging, blood product activation, surgical consult. He moved with the confidence of someone who had done this many times because he had. Lauryn positioned herself near the cardiac monitors in the back corner of the bay. She did it the same way she did everything, without calling attention to it, without explanation. She watched the numbers. The pulse pressure was narrowing, systolic dropping, diastolic creeping up, heart rate climbing past 140 and still going. She watched Damon's chest. She watched the way he labored to breathe, the way each inhale seemed to cost him something he didn't have left to spend. She stepped forward and pressed 2 fingers lightly against his neck, not his carotid, not his pulse, but just below his jaw where the external jugular ran. The vein was distended, visible, rising under the skin. She moved to the stethoscope hanging on the bay rack. She pressed it to Damon's chest wall, just left of center, beneath the hemostatic dressing, and she listened. Muffled. Heart sounds muffled under fluid collecting in the pericardial sac, damping the chambers like hands cupped around a speaker. She looked at the monitor. Pulse pressure of 11. Dr. Okonkwo. He didn't look up. He was reviewing the abdominal imaging that had just come through on the portable unit. Dr. Okonkwo, a fraction louder. Not now, Bast. He's developing cardiac tamponade. Her voice was even without urgency, which was somehow more alarming than urgency would have been. His pulse pressure is 11. Heart sounds are muffled. He has JVD. Beck's triad. If you move him to the OR right now, he will arrest before you reach the elevator. The room paused, not stopped, paused, the way it does when something lands that nobody knows what to do with. Okonkwo looked up. The expression on his face was the one reserved for people who had just wasted his time in a crisis. You're reading neck veins and auscultating heart sounds, and you want me to change my surgical plan. Yes, sir, he needs pericardiocentesis, or he needs his chest opened. Here, now, before. Get her out of this bay, Okonkwo said to Sandra. Sandra started to move. She was 3 steps in when she looked at Lauryn's face, not panicked, not wounded, not uncertain. It was the face of someone watching a clock tick toward a number they already knew. Sandra slowed. But Okonkwo had already turned back to the table. Get the OR on the line. Tell them we're 5 minutes out. They moved Damon to the transport gurney at 11:31 p.m. At 11:32, the monitor went flat. The alarm didn't wail. It held one single, continuous, terrible tone, the sound that everyone in emergency medicine learns to hear differently from all other sounds. Okonkwo called for the crash cart, defibrillation, compressions. He ran the code the way he had been trained to run it, which was correctly, and it didn't work, because cardiac tamponade is a mechanical problem, and electricity and chest compressions cannot resolve a mechanical problem. First shock, no rhythm. Second shock, no rhythm. 90 seconds, 2 minutes. Lauryn had not moved from the center of the bay. She watched Okonkwo work with an expression that Sandra would describe later to her own husband as the saddest thing she had ever seen on a person's face in a room full of professionals trying their hardest. Not helplessness, anticipatory grief. Then Lauryn walked forward. She moved to the supply table and pulled on a pair of gloves, and she said, "Stop compressions," in a voice that was not loud. SFC Riker, who had been standing against the wall, looked at her. Something passed across his face, some rapid recalibration, and he put a hand on the shoulder of the resident who had been doing compressions. The resident stopped. "What are you?" Okonkwo started. "Step back, Pierce." She had the gloves on. "I'm going to open his chest." "You are an ER technician. You are not." One of the Green Berets moved from the wall. He didn't say anything. He simply placed himself between Okonkwo and the table and stood there, and the geometry of the room changed completely. Riker looked at Lauryn, and something in his voice when he spoke was careful. "What do you need, ma'am?" She looked at Sandra. In 19 years, Sandra Reel had received a great many orders in this bay. She knew an order when she heard one. She didn't know why she recognized this as one when it came from an ER tech in a crisis, but she did, and she moved. "Thoracotomy tray," Lauryn said. 10-blade, betadine. Rib retractor if this bay has one. Now, Sandra. Sandra moved. Okonkwo made one more attempt. "You cannot perform a thoracotomy, you are not licensed." And the operator adjusted his position by 4 inches, and Okonkwo did not finish the sentence. Lauryn did not explain herself. She prepared the field. She made the incision in the left fourth intercostal space with the certainty of someone completing a motion they had made hundreds of times before, in worse conditions, in darker places, with far less equipment around them. The ER residents watched. The nurses watched. The Green Berets watched, and they watched differently than the civilians. With the recognition of people who had seen this kind of precision somewhere before and knew exactly what it meant. She opened the pericardium. Dark, deoxygenated blood drained from the sac, the tamponade releasing. She began cardiac massage with her hands, direct compressions on the heart itself, rhythmic and steady. Vasopressors, she said to Sandra, who was already reaching. EP's in, Sandra said. Blood products running? Running. 60 seconds of cardiac massage, 90. At the 2-minute mark, Damon's heart moved under her palms. She felt it before the monitor showed it, a weak, stuttering contraction, barely there, like someone taking a first breath after going under. The monitor spiked, then again. Then it found something unsteady but real, a rhythm, fragile and climbing, beeping into the stunned silence of the room. Sinus tachycardia, said the resident at the monitor, and his voice broke slightly on the second word. Lauryn kept her hands on Damon's heart for another 30 seconds, feeling it strengthen before she stepped back. The room exhaled. Damon's eyes opened at the edges, just barely, the eyes of someone returning from a very long distance. He stared at the ceiling. He turned his head with tremendous effort, and his gaze found the face above him. He blinked. His cracked, blood-dark fingers reached up and closed weakly around her wrist. Doc Bast, he breathed. His voice was barely sound. Thought you got out of medicine. She covered his hand with hers. I've got you, Sergeant, she said quietly. Stay with me, that's an order. His eyes drifted closed. Yes, ma'am, he said, and it was the last thing he said for several hours. The double doors at the end of the bay opened. Dr. Walter Sims, the hospital's chief administrator, came through first, his face arranged into the expression of a man who had just been told something he was not equipped to process. Behind him came 2 men in army dress greens, the kind with the gold insignia on the collar that made the MPs near the door instinctively square their shoulders. Brigadier General Paul Henning walked past Sims. He walked past Okonkwo, who was still standing against the wall. He walked past the Green Berets, who came to attention as he passed. He walked directly to Lauryn Bast, who was stripping off her gloves at the supply table, and he stopped. He looked at her for a long moment. Captain Bast, he said quietly, like a fact he was confirming. Lauryn met his eyes and said nothing. Dr. Sims stepped forward, his administrator's instinct for institutional liability filling the silence. General, our records indicate Ms. Bast holds a civilian technician certification. There are significant legal considerations around the procedure she just. Her file is sealed under Department of Defense classification. Henning's voice did not rise. Dr. Sims, Captain Lauryn Bast, served as a forward surgical team commander with the 82nd Airborne Division. 3 tours. She performed over 400 field surgeries in Afghanistan and Iraq. She was awarded the Silver Star for actions during a mass casualty event at Firebase Coast in 2019. Sandra set down the supply kit she was holding. Okonkwo made a sound that wasn't quite a word. 4 years ago, Henning continued, and something in his delivery shifted by a degree that only careful attention would have caught. Something that cost him something to say. Captain Bast's forward surgical team was aboard a medical evacuation flight out of Kandahar that went down in the mountains. All 8 members of her team were killed. He paused. She had remained behind at the forward operating seat to complete an emergency surgery on a Marine who couldn't be moved. She was supposed to be on that aircraft. The room held its breath. Lauryn had turned slightly away from the group. Her jaw was set. She was looking at the far wall of the bay, at nothing, at something that no one else in the room could see. She resigned her commission 6 months after the crash, Henning said. She requested a complete record seal. She completed an ER technician certification and entered civilian employment. He let that sit with the room for a moment. Then, in a voice that had lost the quality of a formal briefing and taken on something more personal, I found her name in this hospital's personnel file tonight. When my aide was coordinating the divert transport, I knew then that Sergeant Chu was going to make it home. Dr. Sims had gone the color of old chalk. The thoracotomy she performed, the legal exposure for this hospital, is covered under Georgia's emergency exception statutes for trained personnel acting under imminent threat to life. Henning's eyes moved to Okonkwo with a quiet precision. I would suggest the conversation about credentials be one you have with your legal team at a time when the man she just brought back from cardiac arrest is not still on the table in front of you. Okonkwo said nothing. Sims said nothing. Lauryn turned back to the room. The tear tracks on her cheeks were the only sign of anything she was not containing. When she spoke, her voice was quiet and directed at no one specifically. I didn't want anyone to know, she said. I wasn't running from anything. I couldn't be the surgeon anymore. I couldn't be the person everyone looked to when it was the last chance, not after losing them. She stopped, pressed her lips together, started again. I thought if I came back to the floor with the rank, I could help without being responsible for the whole room. Just be present, just be useful, without being the last line every single time. She looked at Damon on the table. His chest rose and fell with the steady rhythm of the ventilator. He was on my table in Kandahar 2 years ago, she said. Fragmentation to the left thigh. I almost lost him then, too. A small sound that might, under different circumstances, have been close to a laugh. He told me his entire life story in the time it took me to close. The whole thing. His mom in Sacramento, his dog, the truck he was going to buy when he got home. Henning nodded slowly and said nothing. It was the break room, 40 minutes later, where Okonkwo found her. She was at the sink, running the water cold, washing her hands for the 3rd time since the bay. The blood was long gone. She kept washing anyway. He stood in the doorway. He was a man who had arrived in most rooms of his life with a certain weight to him, the weight of competence and authority that his position conferred. He arrived in this doorway with considerably less of it. I was wrong, he said. No qualification, no framing, just the statement. Lauryn kept her hands under the water. From the day you walked in, he continued, I put you in a category before I knew a single thing about you, and I stayed there even when you were right about the compartment syndrome, and right about the tamponade, and, he stopped. I almost killed him. No, Lauryn said. She turned off the faucet. You ran the code correctly. You did everything your training gave you. Tonight was a failure of information, not of your surgical skill. He absorbed that. It seemed to cost him something to receive it without deflecting it back. The thoracotomy, he said after a moment. I've read about the procedure. I've never seen anyone execute it with that kind of. Where did you learn to do that? In a compound in Helmand Province in 2018, Lauryn said, drying her hands. 2 in the morning. Field tent. 2 inches of standing water on the floor. She looked at him. You're a good surgeon, Pierce. This is a good hospital. But there are things the OR doesn't prepare you for, and that's not a failure. It's just the shape of what you've had to survive. You can't practice what you've never needed. Okonkwo stood with the weight of that. Yes, ma'am, he said. She almost smiled. Almost. She picked up her stethoscope from the counter and walked past him into the hallway. They were moving Damon toward the ambulance bay for transfer to the military medical center, when SFC Riker stepped clear of the moving cluster and placed himself in her path. He was holding something, a challenge coin, heavy and dark at the edges, the unit insignia worn smooth from years of hands. He pressed it into her palm without ceremony. He talked about you, Riker said. After Kandahar, told the whole team, said you kept him on that table with one hand and sheer stubbornness the entire time. He looked at the coin in her hand, then back at her, said he'd never met anyone who fought harder for somebody else's life than their own. Lauryn closed her fingers around the coin. Get him home safe, she said. Yes, ma'am. At the ambulance bay doors, Brigadier General Henning turned. He faced her from across the loading area, and his posture shifted, not the posture of a general managing a situation, but the posture of a soldier rendering what was owed. He brought his hand up in a salute that was slow, precise, and held. Behind him, one by one, Riker and his 3 operators followed. 4 Green Berets in blood-dried camouflage, saluting a woman in stained technician scrubs with a laminated badge on her chest. Lauryn Bast stood in the open doorway of Grady Memorial and returned it, one clean, correct salute, and then let her hand drop and turned around. Sandra was behind her, clipboard in hand, The way Sandra always had a clipboard, which was the mechanism by which 19 years of Grady Memorial had kept itself organized. Bay 7, Sandra said. Her voice was different, not softer, exactly. Just honest in a way it hadn't been before. Patient in 7 needs a new IV line. Lauryn took the clipboard. I've got it, she said. She walked back down the corridor, back into the noise and the light and the ordinary, ongoing emergency of keeping people alive. The badge on her chest said what it had always said. The name hadn't changed. But she walked differently. Not more visibly. If anything, less. The particular, deliberate dimming she had spent 3 years maintaining had released something in the last hour, something she hadn't known she was still carrying, until she felt it go. She had believed that stepping down meant stepping away from the weight of it. She understood now that the weight had never lived in the title. It had lived in the empty seats on a plane she hadn't been on. And in the years of carrying the guilt of the one who remained. Damon had said her name in the gray-white dark of the bay with the last of what he had, and something in her had answered before her mind caught up. Not the surgeon, not the captain, just Lauryn, who could not stop herself from fighting for the person in front of her, in whatever role, under whatever name, with whatever was in her hands. That had always been enough. She just needed tonight to let it be.